I'm Clara. I'm 34. And by the time my phone started buzzing that morning, I was already 3 towns away, sitting in my parked car with the engine off, watching the porch light of a bookstore I had just been told, again, not to bother showing up for. The street outside was strung with paper lanterns for a party I hadn't officially been invited to, and somewhere behind that lit window, my whole family was standing around believing a piece of paper was one signature away from being finished. 40 missed calls in under an hour. My mother's name attached to 22 of them. My brother's name attached to most of the rest. And all I had done? The only thing I had done was send one sentence into a family group chat that morning. 9 words. That's all it took to bring the whole thing down. 3 weeks before that, none of this had crossed my mind at all. I live in Burlington, Vermont, about an hour from the town I grew up in. I work as a title examiner, which means I spend my days reading property records for a living. Deeds, liens, easements, the fine print nobody else wants to read before they buy a house or refinance one. It is not a glamorous job. People at parties tend to change the subject the second I mention it. But it is a careful one. You learn to notice when a document says one thing on the surface and something slightly different underneath. You learn that the small print is usually where the truth lives, tucked into a clause on page 4 while everyone's attention stays on the cover page. My coworker Nora, who sits 2 desks over from me and has heard more about my family than any coworker should reasonably have to hear, used to joke that I brought my job home with me. "You read your own family like a title report," she told me once, only half kidding, after I'd spent 20 minutes explaining why I thought something felt off about a birthday dinner that had quietly moved locations without telling me. She wasn't wrong. I've never been able to just let a small inconsistency sit unexamined. It's probably why I ended up in this line of work in the first place. My mother, Deborah, likes to describe my job at parties as something with paperwork, in the same tone she'd use for a hobby that hadn't quite worked out. My father, Frank, mostly just nods along to whatever she says and adds very little of his own. My brother Ryan runs a landscaping company 2 towns over, the kind with a fleet of trucks that grew a little faster than the bank account behind it. My niece Sophie is 16, glued to her phone the way 16-year-olds are, and she is, without question, the reason any of this came to light at all, even though she never once meant for it to happen that way. And then there was my grandmother. Nan, we called her Eleanor Hollis. She died 4 years ago at 79. And she is the entire reason I'm telling you this story at all. Nan opened a bookstore in Millbrook Falls, Vermont, with my grandfather, back before my mother was even born. 45 years. The store has stood on Main Street, in a 2-story wood frame building from 1890 with a bell over the door that still doesn't ring quite right, and floorboards that announce every visitor before you actually see them. Hollis Books? Oak shelves my grandfather built by hand, 1 section at a time. Over a summer he apparently complained about constantly handwritten staff recommendation cards taped to the shelf edges in Nan's looping handwriting, half of them still up there 4 years after she passed, because nobody in the family had the heart to take them down. I spent every summer of my childhood in that store, shelving returns, dusting the same corner shelf that always collected dust faster than the rest for reasons nobody ever figured out, smelling the particular smell of 45 years of paper and old glue and coffee that never quite leaves a building like that. Nan used to let me ring up customers on the old brass register once I was tall enough to reach it properly, and she'd stand behind me the whole time. Not because she thought I'd mess it up, but because she liked the company. She used to say the store taught her more about people than 40 years of small talk ever could, that you could tell everything you needed to know about somebody by which section they drifted toward first, whether they read the last page before they bought a mystery, whether they said thank you to a cashier who was 12 years old and clearly still learning the register. Ryan and Sophie's father's side of the family used to come up for maybe 1 weekend a summer, and even then Ryan spent most of it outside with friends from town rather than behind the counter. I never resented him for that, not as a kid. It just meant the store became more mine than his by default. The way things tend to sort themselves out in families without anyone deciding it on purpose. Nobody assigned me the job of being the one who showed up. It just settled onto me the way water settles into the lowest point in a room. And by the time anyone might have noticed the pattern forming, it had already hardened into how things were. I was the grandchild who showed up. Not because anyone assigned it to me. I just did. I drove up on weekends when I could, even after I moved to Burlington for work. I paid for a new furnace quietly one winter when Nan's pension came up short, and she was too proud to ask anyone directly. When my mother needed a ride to the airport at 5 a.m. for some conference she'd signed up for, I was the one who did it every single time, without being asked twice, while Ryan slept in and Sophie was too young yet to drive. None of that ever seemed to register as anything worth mentioning. It just became the baseline, the expectation, and every year, without fail, there would be some family gathering where I'd find out, a day or two late, that plans had shifted and nobody had thought to loop me in. A birthday moved up by a day. A dinner moved to a different restaurant across town. Christmas. 3 years running. Somehow always landing on a date slightly different from the one I'd been given. Small things, mostly, when you look at any one of them by itself. It's only when you stack 3 years of them side by side that the pattern stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like something else entirely. I mentioned this to Nora once. The pattern of it, half expecting her to tell me I was reading too much into it. She didn't. "That's not an accident 3 years running," she said. "That's a system somebody built on purpose, and you're just now getting close enough to see the gears." I didn't think much more about it after that conversation. Not until the Tuesday my niece hit send on a text by mistake. That Tuesday. My phone buzzed with a text notification from a thread simply called Family. I didn't think anything of it at first. Sophie had added me by accident. I know that now. She'd meant to forward a screenshot to a friend with a nearly identical name saved right above mine in her contacts list. And instead, she looped me straight into the family group chat that none of us had actually used in months. 32 messages, all from the previous 2 days, all circling around something called Founders Weekend. Founders Weekend is the yearly celebration Hollis Books holds every fall. The same weekend Nan always insisted on, going back decades. Tied to the anniversary of the day she and my grandfather first opened the doors with exactly 40 boxes of used books, and a hand-painted sign neither of them had any real experience painting. Half the town shows up, not just family, actual neighbors, people whose parents used to bring them in for summer reading lists a generation ago. There's a folding table of second-hand paperbacks out front, apple cider warming in a dented urn that's older than I am, and every year our whole extended family gathers there like it's a holiday of its own. Because, in a way, for us, it is. It's the one weekend a year the whole family treats that building like it still matters as much as it used to, at least in front of the neighbors. Reading through the thread, I realized the date had been moved, quietly, a full week earlier than what I'd been told just days before, in a separate, shorter message my mother had sent only to me. She'd written it plainly enough in the group thread, where she apparently forgot I could now see it. "Make sure Clara still thinks it's the 21st, my brother had replied underneath it almost immediately. "She'll figure it out eventually. She always does after the fact. Not like she's ever early to anything anyway." I sat with that for a minute before I made myself keep scrolling, because buried in among the logistics, the potluck assignments, an actual 11-message argument about whether the cider needed more cinnamon this year, were a handful of messages that didn't belong there at all. A line about the buyer wanting a final walkthrough before the weekend crowd shows up. A line about getting everything signed before word gets around town. You know how people talk. My mother, again, writing that the closing should stay quiet. No reason to make a whole thing of it in front of everyone at the party. A closing on what? I read it again. Twice. The way I read a deed when something in the margins doesn't sit right. and something in the margins was absolutely not sitting right. It took me less than a day to piece together what I was actually looking at. My mother was in the process of selling Hollis books. I told Nora about it the next morning, over coffee in the break room before either of us had properly sat down at our desks. She listened without interrupting, which is not something Nora does often, and when I finished, she just shook her head slowly. "You realize you're describing a closing," she said. "Not a rumor. An actual closing with an actual buyer on a building that isn't even hers to sell." I told her I wasn't sure yet whether it was legally hers to sell or not. "Then go find out," she said. "That's your entire job, Clara."
You already know how to do this part.
On paper, my mother inheriting a say in that building wouldn't have been unusual at all. What she seemed to have forgotten, or maybe just assumed I had long since forgotten, was something that happened almost 6 years earlier. Nan had a mild stroke the winter I turned 28. I remember the call from my mother came in at 6 in the morning, short and clipped, telling me Nan had been found on the kitchen floor of the apartment above the store, and that an ambulance was already on its way to the hospital in St. Johnsbury. I drove up through a snowstorm that morning without stopping once, arrived before my mother did, and sat in a hard plastic chair outside the room for 3 hours before anyone would tell me anything. She recovered well, mostly. Slight weakness on her left side that never fully went away. A slower way of getting up out of chairs. But her mind stayed as sharp as it had always been. Maybe sharper, in the particular way people get when something reminds them how little time they actually have left to use. It scared her enough, though, that she spent the following spring doing something the rest of the family found a little embarrassing at the time. She converted the bookstore's ownership into a limited liability company, Hollis Books LLC, and had a lawyer draw up an operating agreement naming me, specifically, as the sole managing member. She told me about it herself, before she told anyone else, sitting up in a hospital bed with a blanket that was too thin for how cold that room always seemed to be. "I've been thinking about the store," she said. No preamble at all, the way she said most things that mattered to her. "I don't want your mother deciding what happens to it the day I'm gone. Not because I don't love her, because she'd sell it by Thursday and feel good about it by Friday. And that place deserves better than a quick decision made out of convenience." I remember sitting across from her at the little table by the register where she did the books every Sunday night, while she explained it to me like it was the most obvious decision in the world. "I want somebody who reads the fine print running this after I'm gone," she told me, tapping the table once with her finger for emphasis. "Not somebody who wants it sold the second it's inconvenient to keep. You're the only one in this family who actually reads what's put in front of you before you sign it." At the time, my mother had rolled her eyes about it at a family dinner 2 weeks later. "Mom's being dramatic again," she'd said, loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, glancing at me like I should be embarrassed on Nan's behalf. Nobody argued with her. I didn't either, honestly. It felt like an old woman's fussiness, a symbolic gesture more than a real one. I signed what I needed to sign, filed the papers away in a drawer, and didn't think about any of it again for years. 6 years later, sitting in my apartment reading a family group chat I was never supposed to see, that symbolic gesture was suddenly the only thing standing between my family and a signed deal. I didn't call my mother yet. I wanted to be sure first. The same way I'd want to be sure before flagging anything on a file at work, where an accusation without documentation behind it is worse than no accusation at all. So the next morning, I drove up to Millbrook Falls and walked into the town clerk's office. Vermont doesn't have county recorders the way most states do. Land records, LLC filings, all of it gets kept at the town level, in the clerk's office of whichever town the property actually sits in. It's one of those small facts most people never need to know until they need to know it badly. I asked the clerk, a woman named Patty, who I'd known since I was a kid buying penny candy at the general store 2 doors down from Nan's shop, to pull the filing for Hollis Books LLC. "Haven't pulled this one in years," Patty said, blowing a thin layer of dust off the folder before she even opened it. "Last time anyone asked about Hollis Books was right after your grandmother passed, And that was just the death certificate filing. Nothing to do with the LLC itself. That told me something on its own. Nobody official had come looking at this file recently, not for anything related to a transfer or an amendment. Whatever my mother was planning, she clearly hadn't bothered checking whether the underlying paperwork actually backed her up, or she'd assumed nobody else ever would either. The operating agreement was exactly as I remembered it. I was still listed as sole managing member. Nothing had been transferred. Nothing had been amended. As far as the official record was concerned, no sale of that building could legally close without my signature, because the agreement required the managing member's consent for any sale of company assets. Full stop, no exceptions written in anywhere. My mother could plan a closing all she wanted. Legally, she could not finish one without me. That should have been enough to make me relax about the whole thing. It wasn't because it raised a different, sharper question. If my mother knew, somewhere underneath all of it, that she'd eventually need my signature, why was she trying so hard to keep the whole plan hidden from me until the very last possible minute? So I called her that evening, kept my voice light, told her I'd heard Founders Weekend was coming up and asked, casually, what day it landed on this year. "The 21st, same as always," she said, without a beat of hesitation. Smooth as anything. The kind of smooth that only comes from practice. It wasn't the 21st. I'd read the messages myself twice over. It was the 14th, and apparently everyone in that family thread but me already knew it. That's the part that stuck with me more than the lie itself. It wasn't clumsy. It wasn't a slip of the tongue you could chalk up to a busy week. She'd clearly done this enough times before that the lie came out rehearsed, comfortable, delivered in the exact same tone she'd used to answer a question about the weather. That phone call also dragged up something I'd nearly forgotten entirely. About 2 years earlier, my mother had mailed me a short-form letter asking me to sign off on what she'd called some paperwork on the store, just tidying up some old filing stuff now that Grandma's gone. I remembered skimming it at the time, seeing nothing that looked urgent, and setting it aside on a stack of mail I never got back to before it eventually got lost in a move. I'd assumed it had simply dropped away on its own. Sitting with the truth of the group chat now in front of me, I understood it differently. That letter hadn't dropped away by accident. It had failed because I hadn't signed it, not because anyone had given up on the idea. This was not a new plan. It was a second attempt at an old one, refined after the first one quietly went nowhere. A few days after that call, Sophie reached out to me about something else entirely. A school project she wanted advice on. Something about local business history for a civics class assignment. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, she mentioned completely offhand that her dad had been stressed about the loan thing again. I asked her what loan thing. She told me, in the easy, unguarded way 16-year-olds say things they don't yet realize are landmines, that Ryan's landscaping business owed the bank around $85,000, that my mother had co-signed the loan 2 years back when the bank wouldn't approve him on his own credit, and that the bank had started calling the house about payments that hadn't been made in months. She didn't know she'd just handed me the entire motive behind everything I'd been piecing together. I don't think she's ever fully understood that, even now. And I've never had the heart to spell it out for her directly. Selling a 2-story building on Main Street in a small Vermont town isn't a small transaction, not by local standards. Later, once things were further along, I'd learned the number the buyer had offered was around $640,000, more than enough to clear Ryan's loan in full with plenty left over besides. Suddenly the rushed timeline, the quiet closing, the effort to keep me out of the loop until the ink was already dry, made a very different kind of sense. This was never really about a bookstore. It was about a debt somebody else had signed up for, and a building somebody else had spent 45 years building, being used to make that debt quietly disappear. I checked the listing myself that weekend, on a commercial real estate site, under a name that wasn't Hollis Books at all, just a street address and a set of interior photos. What struck me hardest wasn't the asking price. It was the photographs themselves. Nan's reading chair by the front window, gone. The one with the worn left armrest where she always rested her elbow while she rang people up. The wall of staff recommendation cards, gone. Every single one of them, including the card she'd written for a paperback mystery novel that I still have a copy of on my own shelf at home. The whole store staged to look like an empty commercial shell, generic enough for any buyer to picture something else entirely inside those walls. A coffee chain, a boutique. Anything but what it had actually been for 45 years. Someone had gone in, deliberately, room by room, and stripped every trace of her out of that building to make it easier to sell to somebody who had never once set foot in it while she was alive. I sat in my car outside my own apartment for a long time after I saw those photos, longer than I want to admit, scrolling back through them twice more, even after I'd already seen everything there was to see. I didn't cry, and I didn't call anyone to yell. That's not really how I'm built, and it's not how I wanted to handle any of this. I called a real estate attorney instead, a woman named Diane Marsh who'd handled a title dispute for a friend of mine a couple years back, and left a strong enough impression that I still had her card in a drawer. I told her everything, start to finish. The LLC, the operating agreement, the listing, the timeline, the lie about the date. Diane was blunt about it, which I appreciated more than politeness would have helped. If the operating agreement requires the managing member's consent for a sale of company assets, and you're the managing member of record, then no closing on that building happens without your signature on it. Full stop. Doesn't matter who found the buyer or who's been negotiating with them for months. It matters whose name is on that agreement. And right now, that's you. Can she argue I'd effectively abandoned the role, since I never actively managed anything day to day? I asked her, because I wanted to know the weak points before anyone else found them for me. She could argue it, Diane said. It wouldn't hold up on its own. Being a managing member on paper doesn't require you to show up and stock shelves every week. It requires your signature on major decisions. And there's no clause here saying you forfeit that by living an hour away. If anything, the fact that nobody's touched this filing in 6 years works in your favor. It shows nothing was ever formally changed by anyone, including you. That should have settled things right there. It didn't. Because a few days after that call, an envelope showed up at my apartment. Inside was a printed cover letter and a stapled packet of documents, sent from my mother, with a sticky note on top in her handwriting. Just some paperwork to help wrap up Grandma's estate. Finally, sign where it's flagged and mail it back. No rush at all. I read the actual document instead of trusting the label sitting on top of it, which is, frankly, the entire job I do for a living, 5 days a week. The first 3 pages were exactly what the sticky note promised. Harmless estate housekeeping, the kind of thing that puts you at ease before you get to the part that matters. Buried on page 4, in language dressed up to look like standard estate boilerplate, was a transfer of my membership interest in Hollis Books LLC over to my mother. A full transfer, worded as an assignment for administrative convenience, which is not a real category of transfer under any operating agreement I have ever read, and a separate clause, tucked in right after it, routing all proceeds from any future sale of the property directly into an account listed under her name only, not a shared account, not an estate account, hers alone. If I had signed that packet the way the sticky note wanted me to, without reading past the first page, I would have signed away my grandmother's building, quietly, by mail, genuinely believing I was helping close out an estate that had already been closed out years ago. I didn't sign it. I didn't call my mother to confront her about it either. I know how that conversation would have gone. Denial first. Then some story about a paperwork mix-up from her lawyer's office. Then, eventually, a rewritten version of the same document sent a different way, a little more carefully worded next time. I've read enough contracts over the years to know that confronting someone rarely stops them cold. It usually just teaches them to be more careful the next time around. So instead, I found the name of the closing agent handling the buyer's side of the deal. A woman named Karen Voss. at a title company 2 counties over. I called her directly, introduced myself by name and title, and told her plainly that I was the sole managing member of record for Hollis Books, LLC, and that no transfer of my membership interest had ever legally taken place, envelope or no envelope. I could hear her go quiet on the other end of the line for a second. The particular silence of someone doing quick math in their head. "You're saying the membership transfer never happened," she said slowly, more to herself than to me, "because the file I was sent shows it as completed." I told her the file she'd been sent and the file recorded at the town clerk's office in Millbrook Falls did not match each other, and that only one of those 2 versions had ever actually been filed anywhere official. She thanked me, told me she'd be pulling the operating agreement herself before anything else moved forward on their end, and said the closing would be paused pending verification, effective immediately. That was it. I didn't confront her, and I didn't call my mother about any of it. I had one conversation instead, with the one person in this entire chain of events who actually had the authority to stop a transaction from closing, armed with nothing more than the plain, recorded truth laid out for her to verify herself. Founders Weekend came a week earlier than I'd officially been told, exactly like the messages had said it would. I wasn't invited, not formally. I wasn't uninvited either. Not that anyone would have put it in those words. I hadn't been given the real date. Same as every year before it. And my family assumed, reasonably enough given the track record, that I'd show up 7 days too late and miss the whole thing entirely. Same as always. I drove up anyway. I didn't walk into the store. I parked 3 blocks down, close enough to see the porch light and the string of paper lanterns someone had hung along the awning for the occasion. Far enough that nobody glancing out a window would notice my car among the others. Sophie texted me around 10 that morning, a single message with no context. "I don't feel right about today." I didn't answer right away. A few minutes later, a second message came through. "Everyone keeps saying you're not coming, and it's weird how happy that makes some people." I still didn't know what to say to either one, and some part of me suspected she already knew more than she was letting on, even to herself. More than a 16-year-old should have to carry into a party she didn't ask to be part of. From where I'd parked, I could hear the small-town noise of the whole thing carrying down the block. Someone testing a microphone, a kid laughing too loud near the cider table, the particular hum of a town square when half the population shows up for the same afternoon. Somewhere in the middle of that noise was my entire family, standing in a building my grandmother built, waiting on a signature that was never going to come the way they expected it to. At 11 that morning, with the whole town gathered on Main Street and my family standing somewhere inside that building believing the sale was one signature away from finished, I opened the same group chat Sophie had accidentally dropped me into 3 weeks earlier, and I typed 9 words. "Enjoy the reunion. My attorney will see you at the closing." I sent it, set my phone face down on the passenger seat, and waited. It took less than 4 minutes for the first call to come through. By the time I finally looked at my phone again, there were 40 missed calls stacked up on the screen. 22 of them from my mother and most of the rest from Ryan. None of the voicemails longer than 10 seconds. Most of them just said my name, twice, then hung up, the sound of a crowd still murmuring somewhere behind them. I let it sit for almost half an hour, watching the porch light flicker slightly the way old wiring does. Then I called my mother back myself, on speaker. Loud enough that whoever was standing near her would hear both sides of it clearly. "What did you do?" she said, before I'd even gotten a hello out. "I didn't do anything you can point to," I told her, keeping my voice level. "I called your buyer's title company and told them the truth about who owns that building." That's the entire conversation. Everything after that was already true before I said a single word of it out loud. "You are massively overreacting to a simple misunderstanding about dates," she said next, her voice climbing half a step. I read the messages, Mom. There's no misunderstanding to explain here. This is about family, Clara, not money. You're the one turning it ugly, in front of everyone, on the one weekend that's supposed to be about your grandmother. I'm not the one who tried to route the money from her building into an account with only one name on it, I said. That part was already ugly before I sent a single text. There was a short silence. Then she tried a different angle entirely. Your grandmother would have wanted this handled quietly, within the family. She would have hated all of this. She hated the idea of it being sold quickly for convenience. I said, that's exactly why she put my name on the paperwork 6 years ago. I'm not guessing at what she wanted here. I'm reading it directly off the page she signed. I let each attempt land and let each one finish before I answered any of them, calmly, without raising my voice. Because raising my voice was never going to be the thing that won this particular argument. The operating agreement says what it says, I told her. I didn't write it. Nan did 6 years ago, when everyone sitting at that dinner table thought she was being dramatic for no reason. Turns out she wasn't being dramatic at all. She was just seeing something the rest of us weren't ready to see yet. There was a long pause on the line after that, long enough that I could hear the murmur of the crowd behind her shift slightly, someone laughing at something unrelated a few feet away. Then, quieter, almost to himself, I heard my father's voice in the background. Just one sentence. I told you this would come back around on us eventually. Nobody answered him. The line went quiet again, and a moment later my mother hung up without saying goodbye. The sale collapsed within the week. The buyer's attorney wasn't interested in a deal tangled up in a disputed membership transfer, and I don't blame him one bit. A few weeks after that, Ryan's loan officially went into default. The same $85,000 my mother had co-signed for. Now sitting squarely on the two of them to sort out between themselves, with no bookstore left to quietly bail either of them out. I didn't take any satisfaction in that particular part. I'd expected it. The way you expect the second domino to fall once you understand what's holding up the first one. But expecting something and actually enjoying watching it happen turned out to be two very different feelings entirely. Ryan called me once, right around the time the default notice went out. He didn't apologize, not exactly. He mostly wanted to know if there was any way I'd reconsider, now that the buyer was gone and the whole plan was dead anyway. It's not like the money would have gone anywhere but to fixing things, he said. I told him the problem was never really about where the money would have ended up. It was about whose name was supposed to be on the decision in the first place, and that his name had never been on it at all. He didn't have much to say back to that. Sophie called me about 2 weeks after that, her voice smaller than usual on the phone. I didn't mean to tell you about the loan, she said. I didn't even think about it until after. I'm sorry. You didn't do anything wrong, I told her. And I meant it. You told the truth by accident. That's not the same thing as lying on purpose for years. Those are two very different things, Sophie. And one of them is a lot easier to forgive than the other. She was quiet for a second. Then, Grandma Deb's really mad at me too, you know. Says I ruined everything by adding you to that chat. You didn't ruin anything, I said. Somebody else built the thing that got ruined, a long time before you ever hit send on that message. I don't know if that landed the way I meant it to, not entirely. Not at 16. But she still calls me most weeks now, which she never used to do before any of this happened. And that alone tells me something changed in her, even if she can't quite name what it is yet. 3 months later, we sat down with a neutral attorney to sort out what would actually happen to Hollis Books. I didn't come in swinging. I came in with exactly 2 options, written out plainly in advance, the same way I'd want any client of mine to see their choices laid out clearly before a meeting like that ever started. Option 1, we sell the building together, proceeds split according to actual ownership stake, no shortcuts, no side accounts routed anywhere quietly. Option 2, I buy out my mother's minority interest at a fair, independently appraised value, and the building stays in the family, run the way Nan actually wanted it run in the first place. My mother sat across the table from me in that conference room for a long moment before she said anything at all. "You're really going to make me choose sitting here like this? I already made my choice a while ago." I told her, "This is just you making yours." "And if I pick to keep it," she asked, "what happens to the money situation with your brother?" "That's not part of either option," I said. "That was never mine to fix, and it was never the store's job to fix it either." She looked at the 2 typed pages in front of her for a long time, longer than either of the attorneys in the room seemed to expect. Then she said quietly that she wanted to sell. I didn't fight her on it, and I didn't try to talk her into keeping it either. I got what was legally mine. The appraisal held up without dispute, and the whole thing closed clean this time. No disguised paperwork mailed with a sticky note on top. No separate account with only one name written on it. I went back to the store one last time before the new owners took possession of the building. Nobody else came with me. I let myself in with the same brass key Nan had handed me the summer I turned 12. The one she'd said was for emergencies. Years before either of us really knew what kind of emergency she actually meant by that. The shelves were mostly empty by then. Boxes stacked near the register waiting for a truck that was coming the following Monday. A few of her recommendation cards were still taped up along one wall, curling slightly at the corners. Her handwriting a little faded from years of afternoon sun through the front window. I found the one for that paperback mystery I still own, read the 2 lines she'd written under the title, and left it exactly where it was instead of peeling it off to keep. I stood in the middle of that creaking floor for a long while, listening to the particular silence of a place that's about to belong to someone else entirely, a silence that sounds different from any other kind. The bell over the door still didn't ring quite right when I let myself out, same as it never had in 45 years. And for a second I almost expected to hear her call out a price from somewhere behind the register, the way she always used to before I'd even gotten the book up to the counter. Before I left, I didn't take the key with me. I set it down on the windowsill by the front door, right where the morning light hits first. And I locked up behind me one last time using the spare key I'd had made for exactly this purpose. I've thought a lot since then about why that felt like the right way to end it, instead of keeping the key as some kind of keepsake tucked in a drawer somewhere. I think it's because the key itself was never really the point of any of this. The point was always whether my name was on the paper that actually mattered when it counted. And it was. And now that it's done, the key doesn't need to mean anything anymore. People keep asking me, since all of this settled, whether I feel any satisfaction looking back on it. I don't, not really, not in the way they seem to expect. I don't feel like I won something off my own family. I feel like a piece of paper my grandmother signed 6 years ago finally got to do the job she wrote it to do. That's a different feeling entirely from revenge, quieter and a lot less dramatic, and it's the only version of this outcome that would have actually made her proud of how it played out. Showing up every time never once put my name on anything that mattered. Only a 6-year-old signature did that. If any part of this sounded familiar to you, I'd like to hear about it in the comments below. And if you know somebody who's spent years being the one who always shows up, without ever once being the one who gets asked first, send this to them today. Thank you for being here with me through all of it. I'll see you in the next one.